Hey, what's up, everyone? I'm Tennien, and welcome to my retrospective on the Phantasm horror film franchise, such a cult classic at this point. The Phantasm series was created by Don Coscarelli. He really established himself in the B-movie market. For example, he did another one of my cult favorites from the 80s, Beastmaster. I gotta do a video on that at some point. Alright, so let's dive right in here and start with the first film, Phantasm, from 1979. The plot involves a teenager, Mike, played by A. Michael Baldwin. Mike encounters the mysterious mortician known as the Tall Man, played by Angus Scrimm, and discovers that the Tall Man is stealing corpses from the cemetery and reanimating them as slaves. Mike then teams up with his brother Jody and his friend Reggie, the local ice cream vendor, to stop the Tall Man. By the way, the character of Reggie is named after the actor who played him, Reggie Bannister, who becomes a returning character in the series and a fan favorite. Let's talk about the Tall Man, played by Angus Scrimm, who has become such a horror icon alongside Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers. So what makes the Tall Man so uniquely terrifying? What motivates him? Well, he goes from town to town, posing as an undertaker, robbing graves, stealing corpses, reanimating them as slaves, as these dwarfish entities known as lurkers, and then he proceeds to do the same thing to the rest of the inhabitants of the particular town he's in, wiping everyone out and turning everyone into slaves. And his whole endgame is to conquer all of reality, all of time and space, going from dimension to dimension, repeating the same cycle until he enslaves the entire universe and bends it to his will and power. So the Tall Man is a mass murderer. He tortures people, kidnaps children, robs graves. I mean, if we're talking purely on the level of body count, he's probably killed millions in different dimensions. And speaking of the kills, how well orchestrated are they in this first movie? Because the kill sequences are a big draw in a horror movie like this, and the first movie probably has the least body count of the entire franchise. The most iconic kill sequence of the movie involves the Tall Man's #1 weapon of choice, the Sentinel balls, which have become probably as iconic as the Tall Man himself. Whenever I think of the Phantasm movies, I immediately think of these magical balls that the Tall Man uses for various purposes. I mean, mostly to kill and torture people, but also to access dimensions. The particular magical ball used in the film is the classic version, the Silver Sentinel, which is used effectively in this kill sequence involving the caretaker at the mausoleum. That whole scene works too on a horror level, but what gives it kind of this unique flavor is like the sci-fi aspect of it, because these metal balls, because they have this metallic shape and look to them, and this technological aspect to their design gives it a sci-fi-esque kind of vibe as well. And I think the Phantasm series as a whole is very fun because it does mash up genres, and it's a horror film, but it brings, like I said, sci-fi elements into it. And so it just kind of opens the possibility of this world, and I think uses the sci-fi elements of it to really do some cool world building. Every Phantasm film too has a different Sentinel ball in it that's introduced, and that's part of the fun part of watching the films, is seeing the world building and seeing how the different elements of that world evolve. If we're speaking purely of other non-character elements and props in the movie that really stand out, we of course have to mention the 1970s Plymouth Barracuda, driven by Mike's brother Jody in the film, which reappears again and again in the sequels. I can't think of Phantasm without also thinking about that car, the Plymouth Barracuda. It's so attached to that series, that franchise. The first movie also introduces us to the Tall Man's minions, called the Lurkers, which, as mentioned, are the reanimated corpses which the Tall Man brings back and turns into these mutated, disfigured, dwarfish entities. And they are pretty eerie and grotesque looking. They have a corny appeal to them. And they're also just another element of the overall world building that this series does. And I do have to say that the Phantasm series really stands out to me in its world building, apart from other horror franchises, or at least B-movie horror franchises. And you can just tell that the creative team and the director are just having fun, geeking out, and going back into this world and adding new elements to it and building upon the previous elements. The film has a consistent theme of loyalty, friendship, and brotherhood, which, hey, it's not that complex, right? But it resonated with me. Being close to my brother, it was quite refreshing to see what I think is a kind of sincere portrayal of friendship and brotherhood in a B-movie campy horror film, which you don't often get in this genre. Usually the characters are disposable, you could care less about them and can't wait for them to die, but here, you kind of care about the characters. At least I did. I think this movie is very sincerely invested to a degree in its storytelling, its world building, its characters, but it also has this ironic distance to it and self-awareness of its B-movie elements. And it fully embraces those campy elements, those over-the-top elements when it has to. All right, on to the next movie of the series, Phantasm 2, which came out in 1988. Also, by the way, the actor who had played Mike in the first one, A. Michael Baldwin, has been replaced by the actor James Lee Gross. The reason Mike's character was recast was due to studio interference. I believe the studio, Universal Pictures, wanted a more up-and-coming high-profile actor in the role, and so they went with James Lee Gross. But you do have Reggie Bannister returning to his role, and his character really takes center stage in the sequel here and is turned into this action comedy hero in the same spirit as Ash Williams in the Evil Dead films. This sequel pays a lot of homages to particularly Evil Dead 2, which was released the previous year. And Coscarelli and Sam Raimi are friends, so that makes sense. But particularly Reggie's character is played for laughs. He's kind of a creep around women, and he's always flirting and coming on to the side female characters who are often introduced just purely for their sex appeal. Always at some moment where he's about to, maybe get laid or get some action, something happens to like cock block him. And they're just hilarious moments in the film. This movie also features a lot more kills than the first one. Gorier, I would say, too, than the first one, to the extent that they had to censor it and edit certain scenes, particularly for UK cuts of the movie. There's one scene particularly involving a priest, a Catholic priest, where one of the sentinel balls, I think it's the classic silver sentinel ball from the first movie, really does a job on this priest, and it's very gory. The blood flow is even more over the top and outrageous, and that scene was heavily edited of all the death scenes in the movie. And speaking of the kill sequences here, there's another memorable one that comes at the end of the movie involving Reggie's character, who gets in this insane chainsaw fight with one of the tall man's zombified henchmen. And that whole scene was definitely, I think, inspired by the Sam Raimi Evil Dead movies and paying homage to the Ash Williams character played by Bruce Campbell. Also, Sam Raimi, who was, of course, friends with Don Coscarelli, wanted a role in the movie, and Coscarelli didn't have a character for him to play. So as a way to have Sam Raimi appear in the film, what he did was label a bag of cremated remains with Sam Raimi's name. And so, yeah, Sam Raimi's in the movie as a bag of human remains. Also, Reggie custom makes a 4-barrel shotgun, which comes into action in the movie and appears in the sequels as well, and just becomes this accessory that is tied with his character now. Also, a brand new Sentinel ball is introduced, which is the Gold Sentinel, which has a number of other upgraded weapon features to it, including buzzsaws, razors, lasers even, Phantasm 2 ups the body count and gore, and I think definitely leans more into the campiness and schlocky nature of its premise when compared to the first movie. And honestly, at times, I enjoy the sequel more than the original because I think it does more fully lean into its B-movie campy elements and fully embraces its schlockiness and schlocky appeal. It's a good time, good follow-up film, and goes completely more over the top than the first movie, so I really love that. All right, so now we get to perhaps my favorite entry in the series, which is Phantasm 3, Lord of the Dead. Here you have A. Michael Baldwin finally reprising his role as Mike, as well as the returning cast members, Reggie Bannister, of course, as well as Bill Thornberry, who comes back as Jody. Also, this third movie is as campy as the second film. Several new characters are introduced, including this boy named Tim, whose hometown has been ravaged by the Tall Man, who killed his parents, turned them into lurkers, and this kid has been like surviving in this like almost post-apocalyptic world setting. And there's a whole scene where this kid's like home is being invaded by this gang of thieves, and this kid has planted deadly traps around his house, and he's like decked up with this arsenal of weaponry like guns. He proceeds to take out each of these gang members and viciously kill them off one by one, and I'm thinking to myself that this has to be Coscarelli's like R-rated version or parody of Home Alone. Yeah, it was just freaking hilarious. The Sentinel balls are also brought back into play in this one, including a new one called the Black Sentinel. Reggie, of course, is trying to get laid again, and in this one meets a blonde lady, and that quickly goes south, and yeah, it doesn't end well. That guy just can't catch a break. Another new character who is introduced is Rocky, played by Gloria Lynn Henry, and she and her sister have also been trying to survive in this post-apocalyptic world, and she's a great character. She's a real badass and has a nice banter with Reggie's character, who of course is trying to come on to her, and it's just not working. One minor critique is that I think she's a little underutilized. I wish they had introduced her character earlier because I really enjoy her when she's on screen. The reason I love and appreciate this third movie is because I think out of all of the sequels, this is the one for me that really develops the overall mythology, and especially the mythology of the Tall Man. You just get more insight into what's motivating him, and also insight into why he created the Sentinels of Fears, and you discover the reason is utterly horrifying, as you would expect. This third film particularly, I think, mixes sci-fi and horror more and blends those two together in a clever way, and I just love that. And I love the developments in the mythology, and the story has some clever use of effects and clever concepts and really enjoyable. Yeah, I think this is definitely one of the sequels that I love the most, and may, as I said, be my favorite one of the series. Now we get to the fourth installment, Phantasm 4 Oblivion, which came out in 1998, and this particular entry has an interesting production history. So after the third movie came out, an up-and-coming screenwriter named Roger Avary, who had at that time recently co-written Pulp Fiction, for which he received an Academy Award for, he contacted Coscarelli with the idea to script a big-budget studio follow-up to the third film, which would co-star Bruce Campbell alongside the returning cast members. Avary, I believe, completed this script, which was epic in scope and vision. It was set in a post-apocalyptic future. At that time, there was a delay in financing that film because of the big budget required. So Coscarelli, in the meantime, put out a fourth movie, which would act as kind of a placeholder between the third film and this big budget studio follow-up. This big post-apocalyptic movie, written by Roger Avary, never got made. It fell through. Now, the fourth film had less of a budget than the previous films, and as a result, Coscarelli used some unused footage that he didn't use in the previous films, which he worked into the fourth movie. And also, you can see the lack of budget in the decision to use a more concentrated location and less use of multiple sets. For example, the desert location environment is prominently featured and a lot of the action happens there. And you don't get a lot of those mausoleum scenes or as much of them as you did in the previous films. And that all had to do with cutting corners around the budget. You do have all of the returning cast members, which is good since that maintains continuity with the previous films. But I will say that this fourth film is perhaps my least favorite installment in the series as a whole. And that's because it feels obligatory to me, like it's a placeholder, it's an obligation to fill in the blanks between the last film and this big budget studio film that is in the works. You do get some nice character development here, particularly with Mike's character, who is more center stage here than he was in the third movie. And his character is developing like telekinetic powers, which is cool. And it develops his bond and psychic link with the tall man a little bit more. And you get more insight into that. And also you get a little more backstory with the tall man, which is interesting, which ends up going back to the Civil War period. And so it adds a nice historical layering to it. Again, as with all the Phantasm movies, you get a new Sentinel Ball here, or I guess you can call it a new one. It's a little different in this instance where at the end of the movie, Mike creates this makeshift Sentinel Ball and then operates it using his telekinetic powers. So that's pretty cool. Reggie is back in action, of course, and he has some pretty cool scenes. There's one I like where he fights a demon cop, and again, here he's trying to come on to the ladies. In this instance, he rescues a woman from a car accident, and they wind up at an abandoned hotel, and he's trying to get laid once more and then winds up in this nightmare scenario where she's not who she appears to be. Things get freaky and then he viciously kills her. And then that's disturbing on all sorts of levels. And for me, kind of reminiscent of, again, the Ash character from the Evil Dead series, who's always brutally murdering his possessed girlfriends. And so you kind of have that whole scenario play out here. I enjoy the fourth film for the characters and for the little touches it adds to the overall mythos, particularly the tall man's Civil War backstory. And just as an anecdote, the screenwriter Roger Avery has a cameo as a cadaver in those Civil War scenes, I believe. And on that note, it would have been very intriguing to see Avery's vision come to fruition, particularly having Bruce Campbell lined up to co-star and doing this more sci-fi post-apocalyptic take on the Phantasm universe. That could have been pretty awesome. Now on to the fifth and final installment of the series, Phantasm 5 Ravager, released in 2016. This is the only Phantasm film not directed by Don Coscarelli. David Hartman takes the reins as director, although Coscarelli does write the screenplay. All of the cast returned for this last hurrah, including Angus Scrimm as the tall man who tragically passed away before the release of the movie. And upon its release, the film was dedicated to his memory. And hats off to that guy for leaving such an imprint on the horror genre and becoming such a horror icon somewhat late in life. So that's really impressive. And that guy is just such a classic, and he stands alongside the greats, the horror greats for me at least. So the question is, does this fifth final film feature any new Sentinel balls? Well, yes, it in fact features a couple new balls. Wait a second, that did not come out right. But In fact, yes, there are a couple new variants of the Sentinel balls, including a red Sentinel, like Suicide Sphere, designed to detonate. And then you also get a giant Sentinel, which has big laser beams which come out of it, which are intended to level entire cities. The fifth film very much incorporates those post-apocalyptic elements from the Roger Avary script. So for those of you who are like me, kind of curious to see what that Roger Avary film would have looked like, the fifth film is probably the best like visualization and conceptualization of what that movie would have looked like. In the fifth film's post-apocalyptic setting, the Tall Man has unleashed a devastating virus and plague upon the world, which is on the brink of extermination, and so it's only up to Reggie and the rest of the gang to save the planet. In terms of the overall tone, this fifth one dials down the campiness just a tad, and its tone for me was more reminiscent of the first movie's tone. And I say that because the character journeys here feel more personal and intimate, especially with Reggie's character. You find him at a later phase of life naturally. He's struggling with his age at this hospital, possibly suffering from dementia. So there's this sense of grief and loss shadowing the movie in the same way that it shadowed that first movie. There are also some nice cameos and fan service moments. For example, the character of Rocky, played by Gloria Lynn Henry, comes back at the end, and it was nice to see her just briefly. This fifth film also features some of my favorite lines from the Tall Man, particularly in this one scene where the Tall Man is talking about how we're all made up of pus and meat, and our very emotional makeup, emotions are just a matter of electrons firing into our brain, and this very nihilistic kind of rant. And so great moments like those that really stand out for me and kind of elevate this final film. As possibly the final film of the franchise, I found it satisfying for the most part. I liked how it weaved a more intimate, personal subplot within the main story arc. I appreciate the ambition here to raise it to a kind of post-apocalyptic sci-fi epic scale. I don't think it had the budget to quite actualize that, but it does give us like a taste of it. So those are my thoughts on the Phantasm series, which I obviously like quite a bit. And as I mentioned, I love its genre mashup of sci-fi and horror, and also how over the top and campy and cheesy it is at times, while also incorporating this deeply personal story of grief and loss, which does resonate. I would recommend it to anyone who loves B-movies or old school horror movies. Anyway, thanks as always for watching, and hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Right now I'm trying to get to 500 subscribers, which is the goal, but also thanks to those of you who have continued to watch my channel. Really appreciate it. And on that note, I'll look forward to seeing you next time here.